outcomes and future, the new normal, I call it, with tackling climate change at the same time, global solidarity for us to work together. So before I start, let me give you a little bit of a background in terms of my own history and my activities. I have been working on climate change, particularly on the impacts of climate change in the most vulnerable countries, on the most vulnerable communities, and how to help them to adapt to the impacts of climate change, adverse impacts of climate change for more years now. I, at the global level, as you heard, I've been a lead author of the I've been a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the third, fourth, and fifth assessment reports, primarily on adaptation to climate change. I am also at the global United Nations Framework Convention level, an advisor to the group of least developed countries, which are 48 of the poorest and most vulnerable countries in Africa. They're a caucus group in the negotiations under the leadership of Bhutan, and I advise them on the issue of adaptation and also now an emerging new issue of loss and damage, because we are failing to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and we are having losses and damages because of climate change. And in my center here in Dhaka, it's called the International Center for Climate Change and Development, based at the Independent University, Bangladesh. We do a lot of teaching and training. We run a master's course in climate change. If anybody's interested in studying here, please do look up our website. We do a lot of short courses, training, and we have a major youth program of our own with university students in particular, not just our own university, but many other universities in Bangladesh, which is under the umbrella of Gobeshona. Gobeshona is a Bangla word for research. You can look it up. Again, there's a website for that, and we have a big youth program for university students tackling climate change and environment. And then finally, we also a network of universities in the least developed countries. I mentioned the LDCs. We have about more than a dozen universities in Africa and Asia, where we have a network of the teachers, the faculty, collaborating on research, and the students collaborating on taking action. So, and finally, a lot of our work collectively is on what we call community-based adaptation, which is working with the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries, both communities as well as the urban communities in the slums in the major cities in these countries, to try and enable them, to capacitate them on how they can tackle the impacts of climate change, which are now becoming quite real. These are no longer something just in the future, but are some things that are going to become, that we are already seeing. Which brings me to the impacts of the COVID-19 all over the world. As you know, every country is being hit by the pandemic, but at the same time, every country is also taking very significant measures to lock down the populations. And the lockdown itself is having some extremely negative consequences, particularly in the poorer countries like ours. So the people living in the major slums in Dhaka, in Mumbai, in Delhi, in Nairobi, in Cape Town, in Buenos Aires, these slum dwellers, when they're locked down, lose their livelihoods, they lose their, most of them are day laborers in the morning to go and work, and then they come back in the evening having earned a little bit of money and to buy a little bit of food. But if they are forced to stay all the time in the slum, first of all, they can't do any social distancing, and secondly, they lose their livelihoods. And so many millions of slum dwellers in the big cities in India and Bangladesh in particular have been leaving because they simply can't continue to live where they are. And it's very difficult for the authorities, both the local authorities, the mayors, the local authorities, national authority, the police, and the other regulatory and health authorities to even know who they are and where they are. So it's created a major impact and tension, a negative impact on millions of people, particularly slum dwellers in big cities. In the rural areas, less of an impact because they have a place to stay. Uh, Slum dwellers have much greater difficulty. And so at the moment, we are working, my center and my networks in the least developed countries are working very closely with a group of slum dweller. They have a federation of slum dwellers in more than 100 cities in Asia, Africa, Latin America, called the Slum Dwellers International. And they have groups in every slum in all the major cities around the developing world, particularly in the least developed countries. What we are trying to do is to collaborate with them, find out what they're doing, and to raise their voices. So we are running a program which we call Voices from the Front Lines, that we are publishing. Every week we are publishing a particular a voice from the front line on our website. You can have a look at our website. It's called ICCAD, ICCAD.net. And we've started with the message from the head of the Slum Dwellers International. Her name is Sheila Patel. She lives in Mumbai in India. And Mumbai has one of the biggest, if not the biggest, slum in the whole world. It's called Dharavi. And they are being very badly affected, both by the virus, but also by the shutdown and lockdown measures that have been taken in her state in India. And so what we are trying to do is to link up the most vulnerable local communities in the most vulnerable developing countries, particularly the least developed countries, as I mentioned, and bring their voices out to reach the global audience. And I'm very, very pleased to be speaking to all of you in the Fridays for the Future, because I follow you a lot and I'm interested in finding ways in which we might be able to collaborate the voices of the Fridays for Futures group, mainly students, together with the voices of the most vulnerable communities, wherever you happen to be living. You can communicate, you can contact them and be with them there, and let us see whether we can bring the forces together. So now let me talk a little bit about the connection between the COVID-19 crisis and climate change. The two are not connected in the sense of being causal, more for our destruction of biodiversity and our lack of, keeping ecosystems intact, and from nature, from the non-human world, from the animal world, the virus has jumped into the human world, and we are now having to face this virus. On the other hand, the impacts that it's causing and the solutions that we have to do are very similar to what we have to do on climate change. So as I mentioned, the impacts on the most vulnerable are the most vulnerable to climate change as well. Vulnerable to climate change are also the most vulnerable to COVID, and we need to take them into account as we come up with solutions. And secondly, as countries and globally, we take measures to both deal with the COVID public health crisis in a public health context, at the same time dealing with the economic crisis, with the shutdown and the impacts on economies all over the world. We need to be looking at stimulus packages and investments that are both safe, making us safer for the public health pandemic. We will have pandemics again in the future. We need to be better prepared. We were certainly not better prepared this time. And we need to also at the same time take care of the climate change impacts, which have not gone away. Climate change is still continuing, even though we are having a COVID-19 crisis. So just because we have a public health crisis doesn't mean the climate change crisis has gone away. We just have an extra crisis. So let me illustrate that by just sharing an experience that we had here in Dhaka in Bangladesh, not just in Dhaka, but in the whole country, West Bengal province of India, where just a couple of weeks ago we got hit by a cyclone called Amphan. It became a super cyclone. Cyclones are quite normal in this part of the world. We get hit by them every year. In many years ago, many decades ago, they used to kill sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. Nowadays, we have a very, very good early warning system. We have a system of shelters. Everybody knows what to do. They can go and take shelter. In fact, we more than 2.5 million people going to shelters, but it got exacerbated by the coronavirus, COVID-19 virus, where people had to try and maintain social distancing, but in crowded shelters, it's almost impossible to do that. So we had a double crisis. On the one hand, we had the virus. On the other hand, we had the cyclone. And also the cyclone itself became a super cyclone because the Bay of Bengal at that time, where when the cyclone was coming over, temperature was higher. The sea surface temperature was much higher than normal, and that can be attributed to the fact that we have already, because of our greenhouse gas emissions, raised global atmospheric temperature by more than 1 degree already. And so the supercyclone Amphan can be attributed to the raising of the global temperature and is therefore attributable to human-induced climate change. And fortunately for Bangladesh, it hit India first and did a lot more damage in Sundarban forest, which is the biggest mangrove forest in the world, and where it did a lot of destruction of trees and fauna. And then it hit habitation. So by the time it hit the human habitation, it wasn't as severe. There were a few deaths, but only a handful of deaths. But there was a lot of damage, particularly overtopping of the coastal embankments. A lot of saline water went into the crop areas. A lot of crops were damaged. A lot of households were damaged. People had to move and migrate and move out, and many of them haven't been able to go back because the soil where they were working is gone saline. The houses they had have been destroyed. A lot of shrimp farms have been destroyed, and so although the deaths we have been able to minimize very, very significantly. As I said, in many years ago, we would have, this time there was only a handful, fortunately. On the other hand, the damage that is done has been great. And those of you who follow climate change will know the issue of loss and damage from climate change. So what we are seeing from the impacts of cyclone Amphan, both in India and Bangladesh, is very clearly now loss and damage because of human-induced climate change. It's no longer something that's going to happen in the future. It's something that's already happening now, and we need to be thinking about it and dealing with it. So that brings me to what do we need to be doing? As you know, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we have an annual conference of parties, the COP. The next COP, the COP26, or the 26th Conference of Parties, was due to be held this November in Glasgow, in Scotland, hosted by the United Kingdom government. Because of the pandemic and the travel restrictions, they have decided to postpone it by a year. It's being taken to November 2021, which is a loss of a year in a sense. But on the other hand, if we make the most of this time and don't wait for the COP, then I think that we can utilize this time to deal with the impacts of climate change, as we are also dealing with the impacts of COVID-19. So I want to share three major lessons that we feel that we are having coming out of this, and then I'm very happy to take questions or comments and have a discussion with all of you. The first lesson to me is the most important lesson that the COVID-19 is reinforcing, but the climate change science world has been saying for a long time, is that leaders who listen to their scientists will be their own populations better than leaders who refuse to listen to their scientists. And this is what we are seeing right now as we speak in country after country, where the leader of the country, and I don't even have to name names, you know who the leaders are, who don't believe in science, who haven't been listening to their scientists, are having tens of thousands of their citizens dying unnecessarily, absolutely unnecessarily. They're dying from the virus, when if they had listened to the scientists earlier, they would have prevented those. Cite a very good example of a leader who listened to the scientists is New Zealand. The president and the prime minister of New Zealand, Ardern. New Zealand has now become COVID-free, the first country that had a COVID pandemic and has become 100% COVID-free already because she listened to the science. And the leaders of the United States and in the UK and in Brazil are three, and Russia even are four good examples of leaders who did not listen to the scientists. The scientists told them what to do. They went their own way. They made their own decisions contrary to what the scientists told them, and they are now killing their own citizens because of that. The same applies for climate change, only on a longer time scale. The climate scientists have been warning the world leaders, for years and years, even decades, and the world leaders haven't been listening to them. So now is the time for the world leaders to take climate change seriously, listen to the scientists, telling them what to do, reducing emissions to bring down the global temperature well below 2 degrees. Countries are looking for 1.5 degree. Very, very difficult to reach that now, but it's still not impossible if we can get the political will. And that brings me to my second point, which is that how do we generate political will? The leaders, we know who the bad leaders are. They're not going to listen to us. They refuse to listen to us. They want to go back to the bad old ways, giving subsidies to the oil industry and the fossil fuel companies. We don't want that. We need a new normal. We need a new green normal. We need a future that is both green and as well as more equitable and doesn't leave the poorest behind anymore like we used to before. So the old normal is not an acceptable normal. We want a new normal that is a green normal and also a equitable normal going forward. And the third and final point I'll make is that the way to generate this, in my view, is from all of us, because our leaders have failed to listen. The scientists have done their work. The scientists have told the leaders listen to the science with one ear, and then they ignore the scientists when they come to making their decisions. Decisions are made on behalf of the rich and powerful, not on behalf of the poor and vulnerable. And so the poor and vulnerable will suffer. Now, and that's wrong. That's immoral. That's not correct. That's not the way it should be. And so all of us, I believe that. We agree that it's immoral. We agree that it should not be the case. Then we cannot sit idle. We cannot just sit back. And to borrow from a global movement that we are all seeing right now that's coming out of the United States in terms of Black Lives Matter, the US has been, again, it's another one of these long simmering problems that has been ignored and ignored and ignored, and then suddenly has burst out into the open and cannot be ignored anymore. And it's not just a US problem, it's a global problem everywhere. And so I think that's the kind of wake-up call that everybody, all of us as individual citizens need to take on board and decide that we will not sit idle anymore. We cannot just not do anything. Just watching and learning and giving an opinion to my friends is not good enough. We have to get out of the house. When we can. Nowadays, many of us are sitting in the house, but we can still, we do Zoom calls and discuss and do lobbying and do advocacy, learn better. So we need to be linking up. And the final point I'll make before I close is that the social media platforms that we have available to us now, like Zoom, like Twitter, like Facebook, allow us to connect across borders in a way that we never had before. When I was young like you, we never had this opportunity. We used to have to travel to a place to meet other people from another country. Now you don't have to do that. I'm seeing people from all over the world now on my video screen and being able to talk to you, and we can discuss and we can strategize together. This is an opportunity we have to make more of. We, the people, have to be much more proactive. We have to organize ourselves better. We need to be the ones putting pressure, bottom-up pressure decisions. And if they don't make it, then we have to use our democratic rights wherever we have democratic rights to vote them out and get good leaders to come in their place. So maybe I'll stop there, and I'll be very happy to take questions if anybody has any. Tanya, do you want to moderate?
Yes.
You need to unmute. We cannot hear you.
Unmute. Can you hear me now? All right.
Yes, go ahead.
If you have any questions, please message them directly to me in the chat box. and I will ask them to Dr. Huq. So I have one question. How are you reaching out to slum dwellers to step up on the climate change issue?
So this is not something we are doing suddenly. This is something we have been doing for a long time. As I said, I represent a group of universities. We are both faculty, teachers, as well as researchers in the faculties of the universities, and we have a lot of students, young people like yourselves, who are studying and linking up with the slum dwellers through the different slum dweller groups that are part of a global federation called the Slum Dwellers International. You can look them up, Google for them. And they have groups. These are self-help groups of slum dwellers who have, formed groups spontaneously, helping each other, living in the different slums in the world, particularly the big slums are in different big cities. And we have been talking to them for some time now in the context of climate change. But as I said, the COVID-19 crisis has become a major impact on these particular groups. Voices to the attention of the global audience and the national audience. So it's based on a long history of working together. It's not easy. You have to build trust, you have to get to know each other, which we have done, which enables us now to move into doing action with them. Next question. Tanya, you have to unmute.
I have another question from the live chat on Facebook. Someone says it's a wake-up call, but do you think the government around the world are taking the lessons from it? They put immediate money, but no long-term funding. They root hundreds of scientists, especially early career researchers, are losing jobs or going into layoff. Can you hear me?
Yes. So a good question, and it's definitely a very, very difficult and critical time for everybody. People are losing jobs, people are losing opportunities, and people are even dying and losing health. So it's a very, very difficult circumstance within which everybody has to operate. So governments don't have any easy answers. Governments are in very, very difficult positions, having to balance many different factors. But as I said, the leaders who are willing to listen to the scientists about the public health aspect and also about the climate change environmental aspect, and then tailor their policies and their economic investments in line with those kinds of advice, I think will show that they are better off and they will come out of the immediate COVID crisis as well as being able to tackle the longer term climate crisis better than leaders who just take a short term view. We want to go back to normal, to the way we were before the COVID crisis, and then you're having what they call second waves of infections going around the world, as it were. So, there's no easy answer. There are all difficult answers. Every proposed solution, has a negative element to it. There's a downside to everything that they decide. So they are not in a good position. On the other hand, in my view, those that listen to the science will be better off in the end. And our is to persuade them that that is a better way forward. And to the extent that in every country where we live, we have an opportunity to do that, to get messages to our leaders, we should try and do that. Some countries it's easier to do, other countries not as easy to do. The governance system at a national level varies from country to country with opportunities that are mixed, but by and large, that must be our role to take place in every country where we live, in every city where we live. The question?
All right, thank you. Another question is, have there been any efforts to get various levels of government to declare a climate emergency?
That's an interesting question. You know, climate emergency has become a thing in the last year and a half around the world, different, and it's been primarily parliament. You know, the UK parliament declared a climate emergency. The Bangladesh parliament has declared not just a climate emergency, but a planetary emergency, which is a kind of both climate change impacts and biodiversity impacts, which is what I referred to when we had the COVID-19 crisis that we are now facing. So climate emergencies have been declared in quite a few countries. The question now is, what does that mean in practice? How do you translate declaration of an emergency into requisite level of urgent actions that are requisite with the emergency? And as you know, Greta Thunberg, our dear leader from Sweden, keeps saying, if you don't take actions according to the emergency, then just so you know, many people are now willing to talk the talk, but they're not willing to walk the walk, as it were. And so leaders have to be held responsible, and all of us have to play that role in pointing out what they need to do to deal with the emergency and making them deal with the emergency in reality, which they're not doing by and large. Some are, others aren't.
All right, thank you. Someone asks, has the involvement of youth and children in climate activism influenced leaders in a positive manner in a way that has not happened before, and how so?
I think the school strike, the Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg herself has become an iconic figure. Wherever she goes, she can gather tens of thousands of young people onto the streets. I was in Madrid last year at the COP, where I joined. I think there were at least 500,000 of us on the streets of Madrid in Spain when she was there. That is huge. That's a lot. No leader can ignore them. They can try to ignore. They'll give them a sort of pat on the back and listen to them for 5 minutes and then go back to normal. And that's what she said. She came to the COP, spoke for a little while. People listened to her, and then when she left, they went back to business as normal. It was as if she had almost zero impact on what was happening in the Conference of Parties, where the governments were negotiating with each other. She had a big impact on the streets in Madrid. People, from Spain gathered and supported her, but the negotiators and the governments almost ignored her. And that's really the disconnect that we need to find ways to break. We have to connect to these leaders and make them listen to reason.
All right. Next. Yes, thank you. Someone asked, this talk was supposed to be about lessons from Bangladesh. Could you speak to the world, particularly countries that are forced to implement adaptation measures? What can we learn from Bangladesh?
So Bangladesh, I think, is a very good example for all countries, not just the poor and vulnerable countries, because even rich countries are going to be impacted by the climate change impacts. And Bangladesh, I would say, has been going up a learning curve on this issue because we're a very vulnerable country, and we realized that well over 10 years ago, we have been implementing quite a lot of measures on how to increase our ability to adapt to the impacts of climate change. I cited the example of the fact that we can now evacuate well over 2.5 million people every time we know there's a cyclone coming. It's, I would say, by far the best, most effective cyclone warning system in the whole world. No other country has this ability. Even in the United States, when they got hit by cyclone Katrina in New Orleans, more than 1,000 people died. In Bangladesh, you don't get that kind of death at all. And there are other aspects of adapting to climate change. I'll give you another one. Inland coastal area of Bangladesh, we are already seeing salinity, which is partially attributable to sea level rise that is taking place. And as a result, many of the traditional rice crops that we used to grow there simply cannot withstand the saline water that is coming in. And so our rice research scientists have come up with quite a number of very, very effective saline tolerant varieties of rice, which are more expensive than the traditional varieties, but the farmers are growing them. They're reaching the farmers through private sector dealers and entrepreneurs. And so the scientists are producing the varieties, the private sector are delivering to the farmers are buying and growing these varieties of rice which are more saline tolerant and adapting. So that, and at scale, I'm talking millions of farmers, millions of hectares, where they are, as we speak, adapting to the impacts of climate change and salinity. And we would be very happy to share our knowledge with other countries and to see how they can learn from us, because adaptation is very location specific. You can't take it from one place and put it in another place. It's unlike a solar panel that you can take from one country, put it in another country, and it starts working. Salinity is very adaptation is very location specific, but you can learn from how people dealt with a problem and then take those that have similar problem, if not exactly the same problem, and then try and apply it and adapt the adaptation to local.
All right, thank you. One question is, how can we accelerate action in political decisions and businesses if we have to wait for huge continents to change governments, which may not be possible?
Well, we have to do whatever we can. In the immediate future, we can get together, we can build social capital, we can find the groups that are like-minded groups. Once you start looking, you will find people in the young people, particularly in universities, in schools, in the youth groups in general. You can then also find adults who are like-minded in, as I said, in universities, in the private sector. You'll find companies who are doing very interesting things. Now, every country has quite a large number of green companies, particularly in solar energy companies that are working, creating green jobs. You can connect with them. And then finally, obviously, you need to connect with your leaders, your elected leaders, or even if they're unelected leaders, the leaders of the country who are taking decisions at the national level, and try and convince them by whatever democratic means you have at your disposal that they need to take these issues seriously and to look out at reality and not deny reality. This is now a reality that almost nobody can deny. The only people who are denying it are actually uh, doing it deliberately. They're denying it because it's in their own interest to deny it. The denial has no basis at all. And so we have to try and either convince them. If they can't be convinced, we have to remove them. That's all we can do.
All right. Someone asks, what do you think about green recovery and how can young people engage in the process?
Green recovery, I think, is a very, very important one. If you look at the recovery measures that various countries are doing, the European Union has just adopted an official green recovery, which is very significant investment in, on the one hand, reducing their dependence on fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, and on the other hand, ramping up their investments in renewable energy, particularly solar energy, and in Europe's case, offshore wind energy is a new area that is delivering energy at scale, renewable energy at scale. And as I said, every country in the world now has a green energy system. So there are solar energy companies in every country. They are creating good green jobs. I'll give you the case of Bangladesh, which I'm most familiar with. In Bangladesh, we now have the biggest solar home system in the world, of around 5 to 6 million households, which is about 20 million people in rural households mainly, have solar panels and a battery that provides them with not electricity, but enough electricity to run their lights, to charge their mobile phones. And it makes a big difference in their life from the previous dependence on a kerosene lamp after dusk. And the biggest difference that it has made in the lives of these people is for their children. And the biggest reason why households buy these units is for their children's education. The kids tell their parents, how can I do my homework with a little kerosene lamp after dusk when next door they have a light? So the parents go and buy the light, even though it's quite expensive. And they have to take a loan, and they're doing it by the millions. And these are private citizens buying something from private companies that are good products that are helping the environment as well as helping poor people. So we need to find these win-win green solutions going forward, and every country can find them and then need to invest in them and scale them up as fast as possible.
All right. I have two questions that I think are quite similar, so I'll read them both out. It seems that with all these issues demanding global attention and effort, how can we combine all of these to create huge change while still emphasizing that climate change remains an issue? And someone else asked, do you think the world will have the same attention as before in climate change issues when we get back to our new normal? And how will climate change issues be addressed in Bangladesh after the massive corona infections in the country?
Well, the global question is a good one, and my view of climate change as a problem is that by every day, and I would say even every minute and every hour, it's becoming bigger and more unavoidable. It's not going away. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So anybody who is trying to say it's not a problem or it won't be a problem, be hit in the head with climate change before they know it. They are going to be hit by climate change. We are all going to be hit by climate change, whether we like it or not, whether we believe in it or not, whether we treat it seriously or not. And so the best way forward is to take it seriously and to anticipate what the impacts will be and to take measures to reduce those impacts while we can still do that. We can still prevent the temperature, global temperature going up. At the moment, we're headed for around 3 degrees. We can bring it down, definitely bring it down to 2 degrees. We can even bring it down to 1.5 degrees if we have requisite political will, which is something that we are trying very hard to do. I don't know if you know this, but Bangladesh has just taken over. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, has taken over as the chair of a group of about 50 vulnerable countries called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And she will, for the next 2 years, be leading this group. And this is the group that fought for and won in the Paris Agreement on climate change the target of having a 1.5 degrees, because 1.5 degrees is a target that enables the poor people around the world to tackle the impacts of climate change successfully, whereas even 2 degrees will affect the poorest very badly. It will protect most people, but it won't protect the poorest. And so, as the poorest and most vulnerable countries, we fought very hard to have 1.5 degrees as our global goal. Countries agreed to it. And in fact, as it happens, the countries agreed that in 2020, the Paris Agreement was in 2015. They said 5 years later, in 2020, all the countries will come back with their national plans. They're called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. But basically, they are what is every country going to do to reduce their emissions so that we can stay within this global temperature goal. And 2020 is the deadline for every country to tell us what they're going to do. And we are pushing very hard that every country has to raise their ambition to reduce their emissions so that we can collectively stay definitely within the 2 degrees, and if possible, within 1.5 degrees, which is still the goal that we are pushing for, even though it's getting more and more difficult by the day by inaction by countries, as it were. So Bangladesh is going to be taking a very, very prominent global position at the COP26 in next year, but even before then, there's going to be a major adaptation summit in January of 2021. Bangladesh will be playing a big role there. Bangladesh is setting up a major global center on adaptation together with the Netherlands government in Bangladesh that will be announced very soon. So Bangladesh is playing a very prominent role globally, and as I said earlier, it's the country that is taking climate change very, very seriously at the national level. I would say Bangladesh is probably taking climate change more seriously than any other country in the world.
All right. It's very interesting. Thank you. Someone asked, what is the meaning of planetary emergency and what is the action plan for that?
Good question. So planetary emergency, as I mentioned earlier, combines the notion of climate emergency. So climate emergency is dealing with the impacts of climate change, reducing the emissions, dealing with adaptation to prepare ourselves, and then now loss and damage, because inevitably that is happening as we speak, no longer something that might happen, but is happening. The other aspect of planetary emergency is biodiversity. It's protection of biodiversity. And as those of you who might follow this will know, we are now heading for the 6th mass extinction. A million species of biota, flora and fauna, will probably be lost if we don't take biodiversity conservation seriously. And this is something that we have to take at the same time. It's balancing both. And the COVID-19, the transfer of this zoonotic disease, the virus from animals to humans, is a function of our failure to treat biodiversity in a manner that we should. And so if we don't take that seriously, we will have more COVID. This will not be the last. There'll be a COVID-20 and a COVID-21 and 22 and onwards going forward. So we need to balance both. Now, in terms of what countries are doing, not a lot yet, but we need to make them do more. What they are doing is they are recognizing the problem, which is good. As I said, parliaments have adopted resolutions, but the parliaments have to think, and they are not really doing that particularly well, in my view. We need to raise that level of action from the level of talk. We are at the level of talking, not at the level of acting. We need to go from talking to acting as quickly as possible, and that's where people like you and I come in. We have to push for this. If we don't push for it, it won't happen.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's very true. Someone has said that according to a group of scientists at the University of Exeter, 9 out of 15 known global warming feedback mechanisms are now active. This person says that your work is mostly related to adaptation, but beyond loss and damage, is there anyone?
Well, so there are three aspects of.
Can I continue? Beyond loss and damage, is anyone working on the mitigation of risks associated with really dangerous systems like coastally located nuclear power stations?
Right. So there are three aspects of the climate change issue and three solutions that we have to tackle at the same time. Not everything has to be done equally in different countries. The first one is mitigation, which is reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases, which effectively means we have to transition from using fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, which emit the greenhouse gases, or majority of the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide gases, and we need to shift to renewable energy like solar and wind. Nuclear has an option here. It has some elements that would be favorable, but nuclear has other very negative elements to them, particularly the nuclear waste. And it's an issue that needs to be done at a local or national level. It's not a global solution, but in some certain countries, like in France, they have been using it successfully. Other countries have stopped using it, like in Germany, they're going away from it. In Japan, they're going away from it. So it's a country by country decision at a national to do with nuclear. The second issue is adapting to the impacts of climate change. Initially, adaptation was and still is most important in the poorest countries, like my country, Bangladesh, and the other least developed countries, because we are poor countries. Our emissions are not big. If we bring our emissions to down to zero tomorrow, it won't make any difference. It's less than 1% of global emissions. So, but we are very, very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So for us, the more important aspect of dealing with climate change is adapting. And the third aspect, as I mentioned earlier, is that adaptation is no longer enough because we are seeing the impacts of climate change, which are now attributable. These are things we used to think will happen in the future, no longer in the future. They are happening as of 2020. Climate change is happening. Loss and damage from climate change is happening. And so many of us are going to have to deal with this. At the global level, this is an issue that we discussed at the Conference of Parties, and we had a big discussion, which I felt we failed on in Madrid last year, which we hope to take up in Glasgow next year, loss and damage. We have been pushing for that. We, the vulnerable countries, have been pushing for the global community to support finance for loss and damage unsuccessfully. We pushed for it last year in Madrid. We did not get it. We are determined to push again this year and next year in COP26 in Glasgow, and we will look for all of you, particularly the youth movement, to support us, because it's going to be very, very difficult, but we are going to push as hard as we can, and we need a lot of support from the globe, and particularly young people around the world, to support us as we take this forward. If anybody's more interested, I'll be happy to
All right.
share more.
Thank you. Someone asks, could you more specifically address the concern of having nuclear stations and other such installations which may become abandoned due to future sea level rise and other consequences, which could then cause chemical spills and other associated problems?
Absolutely. Sea level rise is an extremely important impact of climate change, which is getting worse than we had imagined. So one of the aspects of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that we have seen over the last 2 decades is that they give, every time they give an expectation of scenarios into the future of a high case and a low case, and then a median case of where things would go. And over the last 20 years plus, every time they do the assessment every 5-6 years, we go to the higher case rather than the median or the low case. So every time we look at what is happening in reality, we see that things are getting worse rather than better. And sea level rise is one of those. Every estimate of sea level rise, every time we do a new estimate, it's higher than the previous estimate. So sea level rise is happening faster than we had predicted. And every time we predict, when we see it again, a few years later, it's faster. And so many, many low-lying coastal areas where there are big cities, for example, who are going to be affected badly. Cities like Miami in the United States, cities like London, these are going to be badly affected. And nuclear installations are also part of that scenario, where if they're located in low-lying, susceptible, vulnerable coastal areas, they are going to be badly affected. So sea level rise impacts are something that every country in the world, even the rich countries in the world, are going to have to deal with, whether they like it or not. As I said, they can deal with it, they can recognize it and deal with it and find ways to tackle it, or they can refuse to recognize it and just get hit by it when they happen.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. In your opinion, did the COVID-19 crisis increase the disparity between genders when it comes to climate adaptation measures, for instance, in Bangladesh?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. The COVID-19 crisis, as well as the climate crisis, particularly in vulnerable communities, particularly in poor and vulnerable communities, disproportionately affects women and particularly young girls. So young girls are particularly vulnerable to a variety of impacts, from socioeconomic impacts to social impacts to other kinds of forces in society that oppress them, and these get worse. With the COVID crisis, they have got a climate crisis, they are getting worse as well. So the females generally, but young girls in particular, in my view, need to be one of the highest, if not the highest priority for protection, action, support for any kind of government anywhere in the world, just on normal justice grounds, but even in the context of COVID and climate change, even more important for them to be part of any climate change strategy, as well as any public health strategy as well.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Someone is asking about, firstly, if you have and what measures you have taken to reduce your carbon footprint and what others could do in that regard.
Good. So my biggest carbon footprint is international travel. So unfortunately, I used to have to do a lot of international travel, and I had a very big carbon footprint personally. Now with the COVID-19 pandemic and being locked down and working from home, actually that has had a very positive impact on my personal carbon footprint, because I'm not traveling anymore. and I will try my best to reduce my travel as much as possible. But I also try and do whatever I can in other ways. I don't own a car, for example. I use to the extent possible public transport or other, sharing with others, um, and do the best I can. But while all of us should track emissions and our carbon footprints, I think it cannot be done by personal actions alone. Personal actions are extremely important, especially if we have more and more people doing it. But we have to go beyond personal actions. We have to go into collective action as well. And simply doing my bit, staying at home, to me is not really enough anymore. We need to get out and do more. And that means connect with others, do collective action, and find ways to be more effective in doing collective action.
All right, thank you. Someone asks, how can we make social protection programs in Bangladesh more climate responsive? And what is your view on integrating insurance instruments with social protection programs to transfer climate risks from vulnerable people, especially?
Very, very good question. In fact, in Bangladesh, we have very large populations that are particularly poor as well as vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we have a number of social protection measures, food for work, for example, and there are quite a variety of different kinds of social protection. Now with the COVID-19 crisis, even more have been put in place. And these definitely need to be taken into account. Insurance can play a role. Insurance is an issue. I mentioned the issue of loss and damage and financing loss and damage before. The developed countries, so far, when we talk about financing loss and damage, are willing to put money into insurance. They like insurance. So they feel that insurance is a way for dealing with loss and damage. We are not particularly against it. Think it can play a role, but the problem with insurance is that it is not an effective tool for the poorest who can't pay a premium. In order to insure yourself, you have to pay a premium, and then if you get loss and damage, the company will give you payment compensation for it. But if you can't pay the premium and you get affected, then that's not insurance. You need somebody else to come in and help you. So what we are pushing for is finance for loss and damage beyond insurance. Not that insurance is bad, but it's not enough. And in Bangladesh, there are some insurance schemes. They are being tested. They've been piloted. Hopefully, they won't be enough. So we need to do a lot more beyond insurance, which includes also looking at social protection and how we can use that more effectively.
That makes sense. Someone is asking if the money from UN green funds is starting to flow through to countries suffering loss and damage.
So let me start with describing the situation with global funding in general, and then I'll come to the specific question. At the global level, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the Paris Agreement, the rich countries promised and pledged to provide 100 billion with a B, dollars or euros a year, starting from this year, 2020. So they made the promise in 2015, and they said 5 years from now, every year, 2020 onwards, we will give $100 billion to support developing countries tackle climate change, both on mitigation, which is reducing emissions, as well as for adaptation. Now, they have not reached 100 billion this year, and almost certainly will not reach 100 billion. We don't exactly know how much we're reaching because there are many different channels to follow where this money is going. But roughly, let us say in the order of half that amount might be going from the global to the developing countries, from the rich countries to the poor countries. Now, if you analyze that amount of money and see where it's going and for what it's going, 80% of it is going for mitigation and only 20% for adaptation. So for poor, vulnerable countries like mine in Bangladesh and the other least developed countries, giving us money for mitigation is not going to do much good because our emissions are so small. If we reduce them, we can do that, we want to do that, but it's not going to be effective. The money needs to go to the big countries like China and India and Brazil who have big emissions to reduce their emissions. For us, we need money for adaptation. So we are arguing for the global funding, hopefully, which might reach 100 billion a year, should be at least half for adaptation for the poorer developing countries and half for mitigation for the bigger emitting developing countries. But we haven't reached that yet. On loss and damage finance, we actually don't have funding coming. That's what we're arguing for. At the moment, there is no money for loss and damage. The only thing there is money for is insurance, and there are a few pilot schemes for that. And so we are arguing for a third window for finance to be opened up. It can be done through some of the channels. We have set up a number of channels. We have something called the Adaptation Fund for funding adaptation. We have something called the Green Climate Fund, which can fund both adaptation and mitigation, but it doesn't fund loss and damage, and we want it to be able to fund loss and damage. So mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, all three need to be funded. At the moment, too much is going to mitigation, not almost nothing for loss and damage. We want a better balance between those.
Yes. All right. Thank you. I'm just going to interrupt the question session for 1 minute to say that Fridays for Future, we have a lot of upcoming talks, and we have a whole list of petitions on Action Network. So I'm just going to drop that link in the chat box so you can all have a look at that, please. So I'm going to go back to the questions now. One person has a suggestion about having a kind of international database of positive green news so that people worldwide can reference this information and use it to share with their local politicians about success stories elsewhere. And it may help to globalize the mentality of governments and companies. What do you think of this idea?
It's an excellent idea. I would argue that it's already happening. You know, there is no dearth or lack of databases and information. The UNFCCC website, for example, other institutions like UNDP, UNEP, the Environment Program, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, many NGOs, institutions. My research institute has a website with information on adaptation. So there's no a lack of sources of information. We don't need to create a new database. What we need to do is to use the sources that are available more effectively. And one of the things I would certainly advise young people, like many of you in the audience today, go through all of them and find the ones that you find are most interesting and download information. You know, we live in a world where information is now at our fingertips on our smartphones, everywhere for all of us. And that is a very, very rich information-rich world. In fact, I would say we have too much information rather than not enough information. And the task that we have to do is to sift that variety of information, and a lot of it is actually misinformation as well. So we have to recognize bad information from good information, know how to collect good information, and then most importantly, know how to use. Just getting it and learning is not good enough anymore. Getting it, learning, and doing something with that has to be the critical factor now that will help us change things. If we don't do something, we will not be able to change anything.
Right. All right. Thank you. Someone asked, how much do we need to change our current neoliberal economic framework in order to be able to address the changes posed by planetary emergency?
Well, we have to change, sure. Now, the question now is, you know, some people say if we don't change everything, then it doesn't work. I don't believe that. I certainly believe we should change everything, but that doesn't mean you sit back because everything can't be changed, we won't change anything. I say we need to change what we can change and work up to changing everything else that we can change. And if you start changing small things, then you can go on to changing big things. And just by saying because we can't change, it's not, I'm not going to do anything because it won't do anything, is wrong. It is a defeatist attitude. And you know, I refuse to be defeated. I think we can do things, and as long as I think I can do something, I will do what I can, and I will join forces with other people who are willing to take action, and we will do what we can. Doesn't mean we will succeed. We are not expecting success, but we are not going to give up. Couching it in the big problem is a means of because we can't change the big problem, we can't change anything, and therefore I'm not going to do anything. To me, that person is not really on our side. That person is a defeatist, and I'm not willing to deal with that person
anymore. Thank you. We have a question from the Facebook live chat. Someone asks, what do you think about the position of the European Union in particular about the effects of climate change on underdeveloped countries and Bangladesh?
So at the global level, as I said, I've been working very closely with the vulnerable countries for many, many years in the UN Framework Convention negotiations. So from the vulnerable country perspective, we have always seen the European Union as one of the most progressive groups in the rich country bloc. So we have these two groups. We call them the Annex 1 countries, which are the rich countries, and the non-Annex 1 countries, which are the poorer countries. And in the Annex 1 group, we have always seen European Union countries as they understand the problem, they want to tackle the problem, they work with developing countries, particularly vulnerable countries, to help us, and we try and convince the rest of the countries to achieve global agreements. And sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't succeed. The biggest success we had was in Paris. We got the Paris Agreement, but then after that, at that time, President Obama was the president in the U.S., but then after President Trump came in, he withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge mistake. Not being part of the global convention and actions is certainly a big setback for the whole world. But nevertheless, European Union remains progressive. As I said, they just adopted a very progressive green recovery, COVID recovery plan in the European Union. They recognize that they don't want to go back to the old bad normal. They want to go forward to a new green normal. We support that. We hope that will include enhancing their contribution to help the poorest countries, both on COVID as well as dealing with the impacts of climate change. We shall see. They haven't elaborated that yet, but we hope to see what they're going to do. Also, just to conclude, the European Union, as you know, is a complex set of 27 countries. Now with the UK leaving, it will become 26. So even for them to achieve consensus within the countries is not easy, because some of the countries are particularly reluctant to abide by these collective decisions and be progressive. So it's a mix of progressive countries like non-progressive countries like Poland, and they have to come to consensus as well. But by and large, they have been a progressive group of countries, and we see them as allies going forward.
Allied. That's good. Someone asks that recently in African countries in the sub-Saharan region, they have been excited with new oil discoveries. How can IPCC data be used to advise governments in a future without fossil fuels?
So oil discoveries, unfortunately, are still going forward, and we are, we have a mindset which is more than a century old, where oil is seen as a good product or a good natural resource and will give us a lot of money. Unfortunately, the history of developing countries, poor countries that have struck oil has not been good. It has not helped the countries. It's made a lot of people rich. The rulers became very, but the poor people in the countries did not benefit from it. And there are many, many examples of not just oil, but mineral-rich developing countries. And Africa is a very good continent to see these examples, where in theory they have rich resources, but the countries do not benefit from those resources. Some people benefit. The global companies who exploit those resources make a lot of money, billions of dollars, and a few rich people, the rulers of those countries, get given a few $1 billion. They become very, very rich. And there are many such dictators around the African continent who have become rich, and their people have not benefited. So even if a country discovers oil, it does not mean it's going to be good for the country. They are better off looking at renewable energy, and solar energy in Africa is a very, very good prospect, by the way. It's developing very fast. It has many different opportunities. And to me, that is a much, much better option for countries to develop rather than become oil dependent, even if they have oil that they need to be thinking too much about and even relying too much.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Someone is asking, what are the major loopholes in the risk assessment process of COVID-19 pandemic control by Bangladesh, according to your opinion?
Well, every country has had to deal with dealing with this problem with inadequate information, inadequate knowledge, inadequate public health facilities. And so Bangladesh, like every other country, is grappling with many, many different gaps in our ability to deal with the problem as best we can. I would not say we are very good. I would not say we are very bad. We are struggling, as every other country is. And we are hoping to try and learn from other countries as well. So we had a lockdown measure for about a month. We have now opened that up. We are trying to track the hospitalizations and even the deaths, which are still continuing, unfortunately. So we have certainly not flattened the peak, as they say in the COVID-19 pandemic arena. The peak is still to come in Bangladesh. Hopefully, we will manage it. And in every country, it's a matter of managing, not completely making it disappear. And how well we manage remains to be seen. Very difficult. It's not easy at all.
But we have a few questions from Facebook, so I'm going to read them out. One is, why aren't people ready to solve climate issues when there is a solution for it? And another one is, what is the scariest country when it comes to climate injustice?
So I think the answer, and it's a combination of both the questions, is that more and more we are becoming, it's becoming evident that there are people who don't want to solve the climate change problem. Okay, it used to be the case that we thought they don't understand, so they don't take action. So once they understand and we give them good science and we do good advocacy, they will understand and they will take actions. But we are now seeing there are a few people, and I will name the president of the most rich country in the world as one of them, who simply don't want to take action. I mean, they're not going to be convinced. They are in the pocket of the fossil fuel companies. And President Trump, before he even became president, was sponsored by the coal industry, the Koch brothers. And he has always been a coal supporter from the very beginning, because that's where he gets his money from. And so the fossil fuel industry, big companies, these are multi-billion-dollar companies, have been profiting from selling fossil fuels. They don't want to lose their profits. And they are controlling major governments like the United States, but not only the US. Many other countries are also controlled by the fossil fuel interests, and they don't want it. It's not as if we can convince them that they need to do it. They are convinced. They know the problem. They know that they are part of the problem. They want to stay part of the problem. They don't want to become part of the solution. So we have to fight them now. That's going to be something we have to take on. It's no longer, they don't understand. So once they understand, they will take action. They understand. They have understood for a long time. In fact, interestingly, we are now seeing evidence from some of the major companies like Exxon, for example, that their scientists, their own scientists, told them 25 years ago. The board members, the owners of the company, were told by their scientists about this problem. And they said, well, let's not tell anybody else, okay? Let us continue to sell our product, even though we know it's a bad product and it's going to cause global warming and it's going to affect people adversely. Let's not tell anybody that. Let us continue to make money. They did that deliberately. They knew they were doing that. It's like the tobacco industry a few decades ago. And so they are no longer good guys. They are bad guys, and we have to fight them.
Yes. Someone in the comments actually says fossil fuel corporations have more political power than those in political power, which I think is unfortunate.
They own government.
Yeah.
They actually own government. So when we go to the conference of parties and governments speak, they speak on behalf of their oil companies. They don't speak on behalf of their
Yeah.
people. They speak on behalf of their oil companies. And the oil companies are there, sitting next to the leader, telling them literally that's what happens.
That's very unfortunate.
We have to fight it. We have to.
Yeah.
We should not have rose-tinted glasses on this. We have to be realistic and we have to fight them. This is now a fight. There's no other way to do it. We're going to have to defeat the fossil fuel industry.
Yes. Totally agree. Someone is asking, what are the influences of geopolitics on climate change issues, and how are climate negotiators dealing with that?
Well, climate negotiators are governments, all right? So the governments are uh, the the officials from the governments are the negotiators. They go and they do the detailed negotiations, and then the politicians and the leaders come and finalize the agreement that is negotiated by their technical people. So it's a two-level negotiation, detailed negotiations at the technical level by and then political leaders coming in to do the final agreement. Um, we are non-government actors. We can only be on the sidelines doing advocacy and pushing for our leaders to take the right kind of actions. But we are not the ones who are making decisions, they are. And so we need to be finding ways to increase our influence, finding allies in the private sector, for example. The private sector is a very good area. Private sector is not homogeneous. As I mentioned just now, the fossil fuel companies are bad guys. We need to fight them. The solar energy companies are good guys. We need to support them. So private sector is not one homogeneous good or bad. There are good and there are bad. Let us find the good, work with them. We want them to make money. We want them to make money out of doing good things. We don't want the fossil fuel companies to make money out of doing bad things. And so if we can be more uh, strategic and more effective in allying with them, sometimes they're more powerful than governments. If we can get them on our side, then I think we have much more power than we would normally have. So we have to be cleverer, we have to be more strategic. Another big player is media. Media has a big role to play. The media tells everybody else what the story is, and they sometimes misinform people. Much of the
Mhm.
media, some of the big global northern media are actually owned by these companies. The owners of the media are the ones who are feeding disinformation, misinformation. All right. So we need to recognize that, find out who are the good media, who are the bad media, oppose the bad media, ally with the good media, and use media as a means of reaching more people to inform more people about what is right and what is wrong. Um, much more difficult nowadays. Social media is a very good platform, but again, social media can also be misused very badly by bad actors. So, we have to be very careful, strategic in finding good allies and finding ways in which we can influence more allies going forward.
All right, thank you. I have two questions that are quite similar, so I'm gonna join them together. Will taking action make our lives better and safer, or will it only make a difference for future generations? Will the actions we take today be enough to forestall the direct impacts of climate change, or is it too late for that?
Certain amount of climate change is now baked in. It's inevitable. As I said, it's happening now. 2020, in my view, is the year where we work. It is already changed. And so climatic events from now on are going to be more severe because we failed to prevent climate change. So we failed to prevent. But it's not as if it's a one-off. We can still prevent even bigger changes, even bigger impacts. And so we must continue to do that. And those big impacts will be in the future. They will be for future generations, for young people like yourselves, and even your children going forward. It's locked in for many decades, if not centuries. Short-term impacts and short-term gains for us going forward. And so the uh, continuing to try to fight for action on climate change, in my view, in the short term, is a win-win for us, both in terms of preventing the impacts of climate change for the future, but also giving us short-term gains in terms of a better environment, a cleaner environment, green environment. We're talking about a more equitable distribution of the benefits of a development for the most vulnerable. These are all tied into tackling climate change now. So it's not as if it's one thing or the other. It's all of them together. We will get some short-term benefits and we will get some long-term benefits out of taking the actions that we want to take.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm going to take about one last question so we can wrap up after that. It seems carbon pricing is the fastest way to reduce greenhouse gases. Is this true from your perspective?
Carbon prices is a very important factor. It's not the only factor. In fact, the price of renewable energy and the falling of renewable energy in comparison to carbon price is a much, much more important factor. And you will see right now, as we speak, there is almost every single day, somewhere in the world, there is an auction for providing energy to a city or a town or a village or a place. And the renewable energy with a price that is defeating the fossil fuel companies. And today's price is more expensive than tomorrow's price, and day after tomorrow it will be even cheaper. So the renewable energy costs are going down so fast that they will defeat the carbon price, even the subsidized carbon prices, very soon. We are already defeating coal. Coal cannot manage to compete without subsidies. Oil will be next, and natural gas will be next after that. And once they're down sufficiently, then to a very large extent, we will have won the game. And now in the post-pandemic situation with the economic downturn that has caused an enormous glut of oil in the whole world, they are in big trouble. The oil companies are in big trouble, and they need huge subsidies, which we should refuse to give them. The one immediate thing that we should all do is lobby for our governments to not give one single dollar to the oil companies. Let them recover themselves. Airline companies, let them recover themselves. Why should we taxpayers give them any kind of bailout? Let them deal with the economic consequences of their businesses themselves. Okay, so this is an immediate task for all of us to take on to defeat the oil lobby. This is an opportunity that won't come. If they get bailouts and they come back to business, it's going to be much, much tougher for us.
Yeah, it's especially interesting to me as an economics student that I've researched a lot into the subsidies and cap and trade and all these things that are happening. And yeah, that is definitely an important factor that we need to reduce the subsidies to fossil fuel industries and increase the subsidies to renewable energy industries.
Absolutely.
Yes. So I just want to really thank you for being here today. I'm sure everyone enjoyed the talk. It was very informative. Thank you for your time. And to everyone else in the chat, please, if you're active, make sure to check out our petitions. We have online trainings. Every Wednesday, we're holding trainings for people who want to organize through Action Network. It's the platform we use to organize. So we have trainings for those. Anyone interested in those, I will share the link in the chat box. And coming up each month, we will do talks. So next month, we have a talk from Professor Eike Weber from Germany. I will share that link in the chat box, so you can RSVP there. And please just make sure to check out the links and take action. It's very important, and we hope you can join the cause. And again, thanks to Dr. Huq.
Thank you. I hope that was useful and interesting.
Yes, I'm sure it was. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Prof, would you like to end the chat now?
Thank you, sir.